Every few years, I pick up a Pokémon game, play it for a few hours, then set it down again and move on. For me, Pokémon games, even including games like this year's more experimental Pokémon Legends Arceus, have predictable rhythms and character. It's been a long time since I had the sustained dedication required to grind my way through an entire entry. Recently, though, I found a community mod for one of the Game Boy Advance games that piqued my interest. Pokecommunity.com user Deo Kishisu created a modification for Fire Red and Leaf Green, the remakes of the original Game Boy titles. Their mod, titled Fire Red and Leaf Green Plus, aims to be, quote, the definitive Fire Red and Leaf Green experience. Deo Kishisu has added a vast array of tweaks and enhancements intended to make the game more modern and playable without altering the original premise or design. One particular addition caught my eye: the ability to implement a Nuzlocke rule set. If you're familiar with the online Pokemon community, you may have heard about or yourself tried a Nuzlocke playthrough. The Nuzlocke challenge originated from a comic of the same name, but it's blossomed in popularity to the point that there's a whole subreddit devoted to retelling your attempt at the challenge and sharing sympathies and encouragement for others. According to the Nuzlocke University website, the whole point of the challenge is to make a playthrough of any given Pokemon game, quote, unique and more challenging. Typically, though, the rules of Nuzlocke are self-directed. This gives a lot of flexibility to add or remove the parts that feel too easy or too hard for you, but it also makes the whole thing a little more arbitrary than I prefer in my gaming experience. I want a game to acknowledge and articulate my mistakes and failures, or else it's too easy to pretend that they didn't happen. If I can technically just revive my Pokemon at the center, I might do that without thinking and golf mulligan my way into a less authentic version of the experience. Let's back up to define the rules of the challenge. Per the Nuzlocke University, there are 3 required rules for a Nuzlocke challenge. 1. Any Pokemon that faints is treated as dead. It cannot be revived and must either be released or placed in the storage box permanently. In the FRLG Plus rule set, this is codified. You cannot revive a fainted Pokemon under any circumstances. 2. Only the first wild Pokemon encountered in a route or region can be caught. If you fail to catch that Mon, you're out of luck. An optional exception enabled in the FRLG Plus rule set is that if the first Pokemon you encounter is one you already own, you can move on until you encounter your first unique wild creature in that region. Otherwise, any Pokemon caught that violates this rule will enter your possession automatically fainted. 3. You must nickname every Pokemon you catch. The FRLG Plus rule set semi-enforces this by auto-selecting yes when you would otherwise be asked whether to nickname a new Pokemon. You can still avert it, but it's discouraged. It's a nice approach actually, since it still lets you omit nicknames when a caught Pokemon will just enter your possession auto-fainted. As you might expect from a set of rules often enforced in your own head as you play, there are a huge number of additional variations or optional house rules you can incorporate based on your comfort level or preference. For me though, I stuck with what FRLG Plus enforced, which allowed me to try to stretch the rules to gain some advantage without the possibility of crossing any bright red lines. Turns out, stretching the rules was harder than I imagined it to be. I picked Bulbasaur, the easy mode choice, as my starter, and set out on my journey optimistic about my chances. Along Route 2, I decided to grind levels to ease my worry about the path through Viridian Forest and the first gym battle with Brock. I also do this when I play a Pokemon game normally, because I'm not a very tactical player, I'm not very good at Pokemon games, and I enjoy the base satisfaction of having a beefy frontliner sweeping most battles. But even low-level grinding in Nuzlocke can be a death trap. I kept my under-leveled Mankey out one too many turns against a mere wild Rattata, and that was it. Dogg was dead. It happened so suddenly I was staring at my screen in shock for several seconds. Minutes later, I realized too late that I'd forgotten to stock back up on Pokeballs, and I failed my attempt to catch a Kakuna in Viridian Forest, meaning I had to get all the way to and through Brock's gym with only the 3 living Pokemon I still had. It took little time then for me to learn 2 things about Nuzlocke. It is frighteningly difficult, and its resemblance to a normal playthrough of Pokemon ends at the surface. It transforms the cheery kids game aesthetics of the franchise into a poison-tipped knife's edge, like a madman smiling as he butchers you. When I returned to level grinding, filled with weird grief and frustration, and even more frightened and conservative than I had begun, still lugging the Pokeball of my fallen Mankey in my backpack, I thought of Sisyphus. Albert Camus was a French philosopher born in the early 20th century. He's commonly associated with the existentialist philosophers of his time, though he himself rejected the categorization. His most famous works are his novels The Stranger and The Plague, as well as his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, which, in its retelling of the Greek myth, encapsulates Camus' worldview with remarkable succinctness. I first read Camus in a college course on existentialist philosophy. I read him to this day because I find his work suffused with unbound, ravenous humanism and an insistence on optimism in defiance of meaninglessness. Camus' philosophy is centered on the notion of the absurd. To him, most questions of ontology or theology, can we prove the existence of God, can we deduce our greater purpose, were not only moot, but futile, their answers arbitrary and inapplicable to the reality of human experience. Instead, he began by accepting that life is absurd, void of meaning, capricious and cruel, without any guiding hand to give context or origin even to the cruelty. Many philosophers of Camus' time who embraced this premise followed it to despair or nihilism, but Camus himself rejected all that. Instead, he argued that absurdity does not negate the value of human experience, but in fact is intertwined with it. The paradox fundamental to his argument is that, though there is no greater meaning or purpose behind life, we as humans constantly seek and attempt to create meaning, whether individually or collectively. Camus wasn't dismissing as delusional religious or other explanations for the universe. Quite the opposite. Though he might chide those who rely on easy and false answers to avoid the absurd, he embraces those tendencies and emotional impulses of the mind as the engine of existence. We rebel against absurdity, despite, or perhaps in part, because of our certain defeat in the face of it. Thus I draw from the absurd 3 consequences, Camus wrote: my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death. And for all the mental exercise entailed in any philosophy, one of my favorite of Camus' qualities is his groundedness. In that same essay, entitled An Absurd Reasoning, he concludes, "The preceding merely defines a way of thinking, but the point is to live." The essay The Myth of Sisyphus is best understood in this context as Camus' explanation of what living is, considered metaphorically or universally. Camus presents the Greek legend of Sisyphus as the tale of an absurd hero. As Camus explains it, quote, opinions differ as to the cause of Sisyphus' punishment, but regardless, he came to be sentenced by the gods to forever push a rock to the top of a mountain, only to watch it roll back to the base before returning to begin pushing it up again, endlessly repeating his futile labor. The myth presents this as the greatest punishment the gods could conjure, but Camus recasts it as simply a reframing of the human experience itself, with Sisyphus as a hero of the absurd because of his awareness of his plight. Where would his torture be indeed, Camus asks, if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? It is because Sisyphus knows that his task will be repeated ad nauseum that Camus admires him, because he sees Sisyphus as uniquely able to recognize and embrace the truth of his existence. That truth is that there is no larger purpose to his labor, no context under which the rock or the mountain can be seen as contributing to something beyond Sisyphus. Any meaning he imparts upon the task is therefore all his own. And it's that self-contained meaning where Camus imagines a sort of joy in recognizing humanity's capacity to fabricate meaning in the smallest, most immaterial things. His fate belongs to him. His rock is a thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In the universe suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. Sisyphus knows himself to be the master of his days. He serves no deity and no dictator. He is an embodiment of, quote, the wholly human origin of all that is human. The tone and conclusion of this presentation is where Camus distinguishes himself from his existentialist or nihilist peers who trend toward despair and self-annihilation. He sees joy in the possibility of creating one's own purpose, of finding beauty in the wild and ordinary chaos of the world. He celebrates the mad attempt to craft meaning out of the meaningless that defines our lives. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, he writes. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. What does this have to do with Pokémon? Well, it's right there in the video title. The Nuzlocke challenge creates in Pokémon the spirit and experience of the absurd. Consider how much the traditional Pokémon run is unlike reality in terms of rules and systems. Death does not exist in Pokémon, nor permanent failure, only stumbling blocks on the path. And that path is linear and upwards. Everyone you meet seems to recognize that you're special, except your jerk rival. You're heralded like a predestined hero, a legend like Luke Skywalker, as if you were born to be the greatest Pokémon trainer in history. Greater meaning, then, is an explicit part of the premise and ongoing narrative. Mass collection is inevitable. Battles are puzzles that can be solved either through succeeding at the rock-paper-scissors dynamics of Pokémon types, or through the sheer effort of repetitive grinding. The latter works because progress is permanent, and the lack of any true failure state means that as long as you continue on, your success is nearly guaranteed. Nuzlocke violates all of this. Death is a constant and irrevocable risk. A random Rattata can permanently and abruptly kill a key member of your team, and a random trainer of bugs met at the beginning of the journey can outright kill you all in a way antithetical to the notion of a destined path. You cannot have a living specimen of every Pokémon in this universe. You will never complete your Pokédex. Well, FRLG Plus still does fill your Pokédex if you catch disallowed Pokémon, so you still can have a complete index, even if it's mostly full of catches that came to you already dead. It's just that the prospect of doing that is now fundamentally grim and purposeless. There may still be a victory condition, defeat the gym leaders, overthrow the final four, but these are mere mountain peaks from which you will slide back to the base, never able to reach the sky-high goal written into the game's motto, gotta catch 'em all. Yet you try regardless, and in ways that now feel more nakedly repetitive and hollow than they might in a vanilla playthrough. I still ground my way through used routes to level up for future battles, and occasionally I caught some doomed wild monsters just to add increments to a value I knew would never reach 100%. Without the assurances of collecting and type variety, it feels crucial to simply grind up your team's levels and abilities to their breaking points, forcing someone as generally risk-averse as me to take long stops in tall grasses, asking my party to use the same 2 or 3 actions to defeat the same 3 enemies again and again, for the privilege of doing that exact same thing once more and once more after that. This repetition is in some ways not dissimilar to any Pokémon run, or indeed any video game at all, But having the normal markers of progress so corrupted reveals it to be, in terms of external reward, little more than that. It's only in the story you tell yourself as you play, and the struggle of that experienced difficulty, that value and meaning arise. I think this must be why nickname your Pokémon is one of the Nuzlocke fundamental rules. Nuzlocke is about giving yourself a story that feels imbued with meaning, and that's likelier the more emotional your connection is to your Pokémon, whose lives are suddenly precious and fragile. I shudder to imagine the experience of a Nuzlocke player who loses his starter to one of the final four. To be clear, the shock and grief is not comparable in any degree to the actual loss of friend or family. But the mechanical possibility of such a loss is a genuine enough facsimile to take on much the same character in microcosm as the cruel rhythms of life. I'm not going to tell my whole Nuzlocke tale. Part of the reason is that the challenge is necessarily personal and intimate. It would be like telling you my life story, including and especially the mundane and quietly challenging parts, recounting every morning trapped in a depressive funk, every warm shiver of imposter syndrome overtaking me in a college course or a work meeting, every real and imagined humiliation along the path of momentary or ambivalent victory. Like the Nuzlocke challenge itself, there is something sordidly compelling about those details, but they're best understood and found in terms of your own experience and perspective. The other reason is that I haven't actually finished the challenge yet, and I'm not sure whether I will. Quickly, my run has taken on the familiar rhythms of repetitive grinding and mashing the A button that ultimately end any of my adulthood Pokémon playthroughs. With the Nuzlocke rules in place, though, I can at least see that repetition under a different lens, as a reflection upon the absurdity of life, how we can push and strive for months or years only to be felled by either the smallest roadblocks or exactly the thing we'd thought everything was building toward, failure right at the visible precipice of success, again and again. I don't really expect to finish at this point. There's no ending that isn't dotted with pain, and the likeliest ends are total losses. For now, though, I strive on anyway. Because, and I think this is the skeleton key to understanding Camus, and maybe also Dark Souls, as hard as it may be, as brutal as failure may feel, it's always fun to try again. I am Sisyphus. Nuzlocke is my boulder, and I enjoy pushing it far more than I've enjoyed Pokémon in a long time.